How do you mean no more commission?
Well, no one in Scotland can commission an idea. You know, if I went to BBC Scotland and I said, oh, I've got this great idea for a sitcom, I've got this brilliant idea for a drama, you know, no, there isn't one person in Scotland that can okay it unless it goes through London.
Good morning and welcome to another edition of Full Scottish. What's happening today?
Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
That need, that desire for independence is ever stronger than perhaps it was in 2014. So there's an obligation that we've got to give leadership to that campaign. That's what Nicola Sturgeon, as our First Minister, has been doing.
My feeling about Boris Johnson is he can't be trusted on anything.
That is now and forever will be known as the rape clause.
I'm old enough to remember going into Europe in '73, and I remember how much of a razor's edge that was a battling stone. And I think we made it by 53%, if I remember correctly, for going in. And ever since that time, England particularly has been pretty much schizophrenic, down the middle about whether it felt British or whether it felt European. And that schism, that crack has remained throughout English society ever since.
Scotland means business. Scotland's voice won't be stilled, it won't be silenced, it has to be heard.
About the work that's been done by Broadcasting Scotland in giving community activists, yes activists, Scottish activists a platform other than the traditional media outlets.
Good morning. We start this morning with general questions, and our first question from Jamie Halcro Johnston.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government what update it can provide on legal action in relation to Northern Isles Ferry Services.
Minister Paul Wheelhouse.
Scottish ministers are limited in what can be said at this stage of legal proceedings so as not to prejudice the outcome of those proceedings. Arrangements are being made to extend the current contract so that services operate as normal throughout this period. This will ensure that communities, passengers and businesses who rely on the services and the staff who work on them will not be affected during the proceedings. Also, the proceedings do not affect our commitment to fare reductions on the Aberdeen, Kirkwall and Lerwick routes from January 2020, which will proceed as promised.
Jamie Halcro Johnston.
Thank the Minister for that answer. In Orkney and Shetland, we've seen reduced fares, which have been promised for many years, delayed by 18 months so far by legal action. Earlier this month, the tender process for the Northern Isles service was delayed again by legal action. Then yesterday we hear that Ferguson's earmarked to provide replacement ferries for our islands. Orders are again delayed and now coming in at double the already high cost. And the SNP's commitment to provide fair funding for our vital inter-island ferries in the Northern Isles has still not been met. The Scottish Government's mismanagement of Scotland's ferry services has been chaotic and embarrassing. So I ask the Minister, how are people in the islands supposed to have confidence in their management of our ferry services? And will the Minister apologise for this catalogue of failures on his watch?
Minister.
Dear oh dear, Jamie Halcro Johnston ought to reflect that Sarwar Northline, the current operator, has a 97% satisfaction rating for the services to the communities in the Northern Isles. He might want to reflect that's... The member might want to reflect that it's not absent of Scottish Government intervention in providing those services through Sarwar Northline. So I think the member ought to recognise the Scottish Government has a good track record in delivering services for the Northern Isles. The internal ferry services are the services which are provided by Orkney Islands Council and Shetland Island Council, and we have increased funding to them. I would point out that the situation that has arisen for them arose prior to devolution in the time of the Conservative government at the time, the Scotland Office. It was, if the member would listen to the response, he might actually learn something rather than chuntering from the sidelines.
He's all at sea.
For the first time ever in the last 2 years, the Orkney Islands Council, Shetland Islands Council have received additional funding from this government to improve the funding of those services. even though they are legally responsible for delivering them. And Mr Halcro Johnston is continuing to chuntering. I'm trying to explain to him so he learns as a result of the answers that his own government in the 1980s put this situation into place in order to get, indeed, that's the last time the Tories have had power in Scotland since devolution. You might want to recognise that. But we have a situation, Mr Halcro Johnston ought to recognise, where this government has made additional funding available to the councils. We're in positive dialogue with both councils about how we can help them address the funding challenges they face. And indeed, the figures they have supplied to us have been fed into the budget process, which, of course, has been delayed by his own government, delaying their own budget statement potentially as late as March, which is potentially very difficult for all local authorities across Scotland, including Orkney Islands Council and Shetland Islands Council.
Well done. Okay. I'm pleased to see members are in a festive mood. Can we have, well, try restricted to a question and an answer rather than a whole conversation amongst the chamber. Lee MacArthur.
Thank you very much. We have the remarkable spectacle of the government's own ferry company taking legal action against the Scottish Government. Could the Minister advise the Chamber on any calculations that have been made about the likely cost, both to Calmac and to the Scottish Government, of this legal action?
Minister.
I can say to Mr MacArthur, because clearly this is a matter that is now sub judice, so I have to be careful what I say, is that clearly we regret the fact that this action is being taken, but we also recognise that Calmac operate at arm's length from government, and this is a commercial tender exercise. They have the right to take the government legal challenge. And obviously we hope the process can go forward as quickly as possible at minimal cost to both Calmac and to the Scottish Government. I hope that he will accept that answer. I appreciate I can't give more information at this time, but we regret it's happening. But clearly we want to see this progress as fast as possible and to put in place the long-term future of the services to the Northern Isles, which I know he cares about.
Question number 2, Anas Sarwar.
To ask the Scottish Government what plans it has to provide additional welfare support for people in need over the Christmas and New Year period.
Cabinet Secretary Shirley-Anne Somerville.
The Scottish Government is already delivering a range of social security benefits and is committed to ensuring that people receive all the support they are entitled to throughout the year. We have also committed an additional £354,000 to support a range of initiatives tackling rough sleeping and homelessness this winter. The majority of welfare benefits are still the responsibility of the UK Government, and we continue to press UK ministers to reduce the unfairness of their welfare reforms, improve support for the most vulnerable and ensure safeguards are in place for those who need them.
Anas Sarwar.
The Cabinet Secretary and I would both prefer that we didn't need food banks, but while they are there, that we must support them. Will she therefore then join me in congratulating the Glasgow Evening Times on their Bank on Us campaign that has meant over 5,000 bags being delivered to food banks across the city? And doesn't this again demonstrate the generosity not just of the people of Glasgow but actually the people of Scotland who are supporting those people less vulnerable, particularly this period as we run up to Christmas and the New Year?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I would absolutely endorse the comments made by Anas Sarwar about the Evening Times campaign. I hope all members in the Chamber would agree that there should be no place for food banks in our society. The fact that we have food banks is a demonstration of a broken welfare system. But while that welfare system is broken and while the UK Conservative Government refuse to make the changes that they need to make to fix that, then it is highly commendable that the people of Glasgow and the people across Scotland are stepping up, particularly at this time. And it's very commendable that the Evening Times have been running a campaign to facilitate that.
Thank you. Question number 3, Rona Mackay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what its response is to recent figures from Rape Crisis Scotland, which state that on a typical day, 1,035 people are waiting to access rape crisis support.
Minister Christina McKelvey.
Whilst it's welcome that more people are coming forward to seek support, we should unite in our outrage that women and girls are continuing to experience sexual violence at the hands of men. It needs to stop, and this Government will continue to take action, including strengthening the law, investing in services and tackling the underlying attitudes and inequalities that perpetuate violence against women and girls. We are investing £2 million in rape crisis work this year, including £800,000 core funding to 17 rape crisis centres and £166,000 to the National Rape Crisis Helpline. The member will recall that on top of that investment last year, this government pledged an additional £1.5 million over 3 years to Rape Crisis Services to improve access to support. I will set out my plans for future funding in the new year, and we will continue to work to ensure that those experiencing sexual violence have access to the right support at the right time.
Rona Mackay.
Thank the Minister for that answer. Does the Minister agree with me that this highlights the need for more support for victims, which the Scottish Government is giving, and that Rape Crisis Scotland's £16 for 16 days campaign, which raised £15,269 for local rape crisis centres and the National Helpline, is a massive achievement?
Minister.
Yeah, as the member has highlighted, it is clear from Rape Crisis Scotland's report that we have much more to do, and we are working with them to do that. We recognise the difficulties support services across the violence against women sector face, and we are taking these into account as we explore the structure of our next equalities funding round. We hope to be in a position to announce our future funding plans early in 2020. There is no doubt that Rape Crisis Scotland's £16 for 16 days campaign was hugely successful, and it raised over £15,000, and I would join with the member in recognising this massive achievement for Rape Crisis Scotland.
Thank you. Question 4, Mark Ruskell.
To ask the Scottish Government for what reason the Strategic Transport Projects Review 2 survey is taking place over the Christmas holiday period.
Cabinet Secretary Michael Matheson.
The Strategic Transport Projects Review survey was planned to start after consultation on the National Transport Strategy, which closed on the 23rd of October. This was to ensure that there was a distinction between the two processes. In order to keep to programme, Transport Scotland are keen to have the feedback from the survey by mid-January. The festive period has been taken into account, and that's part of the reason why the survey will run for 6 weeks, closing on the 10th of January 2020.
Mark Ruskell.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer? He'll be aware of the considerable interest of West Fife and Clackmannan communities around the prospect of reopening the rail route from Longannet to Dunfermline. He's previously committed to a meaningful consultation through the STPR process with communities on the potential for that project. Yet all we have so far is an online survey that's very general in its nature. So will he be able to commit to workshops with communities, as I think was expected, and also to extend the online survey to give people and communities and stakeholders a proper opportunity to respond to the issues under STPR?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, there's already been an extensive range of engagement taking place. For example, there's been some 42 regional workshops that have taken place since early summer of this year. There's also been 7 national and thematic workshops, and there's also been 3 business-focused events. And so far, over 300 different organisations have engaged in that process as part of the STPR2 process. So there has been a very extensive process already undertaken, and that will obviously continue going forward. We've also had some 18 school workshops across the country, with another 30 which are planned over the coming months as well. So there has been a very extensive engagement process for communities to engage in specific issues that they have within their respective areas in order to feed into the STPR2 process. But I would clearly want to encourage the members' constituents who have an interest in the issue which he has raised to make sure that they do take part in the online survey and any of the other further workshops that are taking place at a regional level.
And Jamie Green.
Thank you. The Cabinet Secretary will be aware that the Rural Economy Committee recently wrote to him to highlight the £3 billion backlog of repairs to Scotland's roads. Can he confirm if the STPR2 will seek to redress that backlog?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, the STPR2 process is to look at the strategic project initiatives that we should be looking to support in the coming 10 to 20 year period, and that will carry out an assessment of what are by and large new projects or upgrading of existing projects as part of that. What it won't do is it won't look at specific road maintenance issues in the way in which the member is referring to.
Thank you. Question number 5, Alec Rowley.
To ask the Scottish Government what action has been taken to address reported staffing shortages in prisons.
Cabinet Secretary Hamza Youssef.
The most pressing challenge facing SPS in relation to staffing is HMP and YOI Grampian, where the attrition rate is more than double the national average. SPS recognises the continuing challenges of the recruitment and retention of staff at Grampian and has adapted the recruitment process to include online testing and application processes, as well as a number of other initiatives to attract candidates. The challenges associated with staffing include staff absence and recruitment are matters I regularly discuss with the Chief Executive of SPS, most recently on the 26th of November. SPS continues to support Grampian with staff from elsewhere across the estate. In terms of the wider issue to help address this, the scheduled recruitment of prison officers in 2020 and 2021 has been increased, and as a consequence SPS will bring in over 800 new officers within the next 24 months. As I've said on many times before, and I'm certain Alex Rowley agrees with me, Scotland's prisons remain stable, safe and well run, and that is very much down to the unwavering dedication and commitment to prison officers and staff across the country, and I thank them for the dedication.
Alex Rowley.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. They may well remain stable and well run, but if we adhere to the principles of crime, punishment and rehabilitation, then the shortages, I've said to the Cabinet Secretary, I've met with prison staff, and I'm happy to have that discussion further in private. But surely, if he is going to make the case to the Finance Secretary for further resources for prisons, which is obvious to me is needed, he needs to then have a proper assessment of what the needs are if he's going to move forward. I would hope that he would do that and we could work together, because it's in nobody's interest to keep having our prisons so full and to have the staffing problems that we've got. Will he bring forward a proper assessment in order to put the case to the Finance Secretary for the additional resources that will be needed?
Cabinet Secretary.
Can I answer that question, I think, in the spirit that Alex Rowley was asking it, that of course I work with anybody across this chamber to try to address what are real challenges facing our prison population, our prison estate. He's absolutely right, of course. If our prisons are overcrowded, as they currently are, that means less time for the likes of rehabilitation and other such measures. So he's right in that sense. Where I would slightly disagree with him is that where the prison service has asked for more money, this government hasn't been found wanting. In this financial year alone, they've asked for an additional 24 million and received an additional 24 million. So we've increased the budget where there's been a need to do so. But in terms of conversations I'll have with the Finance Secretary, of course I'll have those in private, but he equally will have those conversations with members right across the chamber. And of course, if there are additional resources in that budget, I'm glad to say that Alex Rowley now has said, of course, that he would then support such a budget. I'm sure the Finance Secretary, of course, will hear that in discussions that take place.
Liam Kerr.
Officer, one way the Scottish Government seems to want to tackle staff shortages is to empty prisons. This week the Government had to breach parliamentary procedure and implement the restriction of liberty regulations without the necessary scrutiny from the Justice Committee. Cabinet Secretary, does this not suggest a worrying absence of planning and preparation and a disrespect for this Parliament that such important legislation has had to be rushed through without the necessary scrutiny?
Cabinet Secretary.
I mean, it's incredible again. I mean, in terms of our prisons up here in Scotland, it is the Inspectorate that says they're stable, they are well run and they are safe. Of course, the Inspectorate in England and Wales says that the Tory mismanagement of our prisons are draconian in comparison to Scotland. Not only that, of course, we look after those that are working within our prisons. Our prison officers have received this year a 6% pay rise compared to the 2.2% derisory pay rise offered by the Conservative government. And on top of that, he talks about prison overcrowding. If I went with his regressive justice proposals, which would see whole life sentences, the ending of automatic early release for short-term prisoners, and his opposition to pass, we would have to build 3 more Barlinis. Where the heck would the money come from for that? So I'll take no lectures from the Conservatives about the pressures on our prison estate. We're getting on with the job of managing that while he carps from the sidelines.
Question number 6, Pauline McNeill.
To ask the Scottish Government what action it is taking in response to reports that there are regular breaches of the time limits aimed at preventing delay in High Court trials.
Cabinet Secretary Hamza Youssef.
I'm sure Pauline McNeill will be aware of this, but Scottish ministers and the Scottish Parliament may not, by law, seek to influence either prosecutorial decisions or the decisions of the judiciary about case management. The Scottish Government has made additional resources available this financial year, 5 million extra to the Crown and Procurator Fiscal Service and just shy of 2 million to the Scottish Courts and Tribunal Service to help to respond to the changing nature and complexity of criminal cases. The member may be aware that a large number of these trials relate to sexual offences. The review group led by Lady Doreen, the Lord Justice Clerk, is considering what distinguishes sexual assault cases from other criminal cases and how court processes and the experience of complainants and witnesses can be improved without compromising the rights of the accused.
Polly McNeill.
Section 65 of the 1995 Act, as amended by this Parliament in 2004, states that an accused may not be held following the preliminary hearing more than 140 days. Yet, when the Court Service wrote to me this year, out of the 492 trials started in 2018, only 3 did not extend the time limits, and there was an average 16 weeks in 2018 where they did not meet the requirements of the 95 Act. So that's a significant rise, given that the Cabinet Secretary has rightly said that there are many serious and sexual offences cases in there which are delayed because of a failure to meet this timescale. So does the Cabinet Secretary share my concern when he has a chance to study this picture in detail? Will he respond to me about how we can get closer to what the Act or the spirit of the Act intended when we passed it in 2004, that the 140-day limit should only be extended on cause shown?
Cabinet Secretary.
An assurance and reassurance to Polly McNeill that I do look at the detail of it, and I have looked at the detail of it, and I've discussed it with the Lord Advocate, and he'd be happy from a prosecutorial point of view, where of course they have the responsibility up to indictment, that he would be happy to also speak to Polly McNeill. I do share her concern about the 140-day limit. I would go back to say that the majority of High Court work at the moment is sexual offences cases, and they do have a complexity around digital forensics and of course a whole load of other complexities. That does not mean that of course we and courts shouldn't pay close attention to that 140-day limit. Of course they should. So of course I'm more than happy to furnish Polly McNeill with more detail. Having spoken to the Lord Advocate, he's also happy to meet with Polly McNeill to discuss the Crown's role in this as well.
Question number 7, Adam Tompkins.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what discussions it's had with the Electoral Commission since the Referendums Bill completed Stage 2.
Cabinet Secretary Michael Ruskell.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. As I've indicated previously, there have been multiple constructive discussions between the Scottish Government and the Electoral Commission to discuss the bill over recent months. These conversations have continued since Stage 2 of the bill. I have now brought forward amendments at Stage 3, which will be taken this afternoon, that build on these discussions with the Electoral Commission.
Adam Tompkins.
Presiding Officer, not only is the Cabinet Secretary seeking to impose on Scotland a second independence referendum that Scots do not want, but he is seeking to rig its rules by bypassing the critical role of the Electoral Commission in its independent testing of any referendum question. In a unanimous report, this Parliament's Finance and Constitution Committee made it clear that this was completely unacceptable and that the Cabinet Secretary must seek the agreement of the Electoral Commission on a way forward. Yet this week, the Electoral Commission have said that no such agreement has been reached. The Electoral Commission should be required by law to reassess any referendum question, they say. Why does the Cabinet Secretary not agree?
Cabinet Secretary.
I know the member is really getting his retaliation in early for being defeated on this afternoon when the Chamber votes on it. But can I just point out to him, because he will, because Presiding Officer, he has misled us on what the Electoral Commission says. The Electoral Commission says in its briefing that it is satisfied with the amendments that I have brought forward. So that position and the position that Mr Tompkins have taken are not compatible. We will have that debate this afternoon. I hope by then he will have read the Electoral Commission's recommendations, and in those circumstances he will not repeat the error he fell into just now.
Thank you. That concludes general questions. We turn now to First Minister's questions. Question 1 from Jackson Carlow.
Presiding Officer, all this week and again this morning, the First Minister has set out her one priority for government. No prize for guessing what it is. But let's see how she's getting on this week with the people's priorities. If you're a commuter, the train overseen by the SNP is in chaos. If you live on our islands, the ferry you need to get to the mainland is in dry dock. If you're the parent of a sick child, either the hospital isn't open, or if it is, you may end up with a deadly infection. Is that a record of which she's proud to end the year?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, the Scottish Government works and will continue to work hard on all of these priorities. When we encounter failures of private companies in commercial contracts, like on the ferries and on the railways, unlike the Conservatives who continue to defend that, we take decisive action. Something that it doesn't at all surprise me that the Conservatives don't like very much. And let me also take the opportunity at this time of year in particular to thank all of those working so hard across our health service, caring for sick children and caring for patients the length and breadth of the country. Let me thank everybody who works in our public services for the sterling job that they do. And when it comes to the record of my government, indeed the relative performances of my party and Jackson Carlaw's party, of course, that was put before the Scottish people last week. The Scottish people recorded their verdict, and I think Jackson Carlaw knows very well what that was.
Jackson Carlaw.
You know, they don't want your thanks, First Minister. They want the leadership that is so obviously lacking. And if your government is so decisive, answer me this. To date, during the course of 2019, what is the Scottish Government's detailed record on meeting its NHS waiting time targets?
First Minister.
Well, let me quote Audit Scotland that said on 7 of the 8 waiting times targets, more people were being seen within those targets than had been the case in the previous year, because we are investing in the health service to build the capacity that is needed to address rising demand. So in terms of what this government is doing, and it stands in stark contrast to the performance of Conservatives south of the border, indeed in contrast to the performance of Wales, Labour in Wales. We have record investment in our National Health Service. We have a record number of people working in our National Health Service. And because we didn't do what the Conservatives wanted us to do in the last budget, and indeed in the budget before that, and hand tax cuts to the richest people in our society, we've been able to avoid a further £500 million cut in our public services budget that would have been imposed on us on top of the other cuts the Tories have imposed on Scotland's budget.
Jackson Carlaw.
Well, First Minister, here's the current score. The 12-week treatment time guarantee missed and never met. The 18-week referral to treatment missed. The 6-week wait for diagnostics missed. The 18-week wait for psychological treatment missed. The 18-week mental health target missed. The 62-day target for cancer treatment missed. The 4-week wait for musculoskeletal treatment missed. The chronic pain target missed. That is your record in 2019, First Minister. When you were showboating before the cameras again this morning, did you not think that the thousands of patients who have been let down by your government should have been due your apology?
First Minister.
Do you know, I'm sure I'm not the only one who is struck by the fact that Jackson Carlaw's angry demeanour is always in inverse proportion to his levels of confidence. But let me remind Jackson Carlaw on the issue of health service performance. This government has an £850 million waiting times improvement programme, which is delivering improvements and making progress. But for Jackson Carlaw, the leader, is what he calls himself, of the Scottish Conservative Party, to stand up in this chamber the week after, under the Conservatives in England, the worst waiting times on record were recorded, is frankly a bit rich. It is this government in Scotland that is investing record sums in spite of Tory austerity. It is this government that is supporting a record number of workers across our National Health Service, and we will continue to do that. Standing up against Tory austerity. That's why the record and the performance of this government was endorsed by the people of Scotland just a few days ago.
Jackson Carlaw.
First Minister, you can run from your record of missed targets, but you can't hide from it. As we enter 2020, we've seen PISA figures show science and maths performance at record lows. Violent crime going up for the 4th year in a row. NHS Greater Glasgow suing the construction firm which built our largest hospital, commissioned by Nicola Sturgeon. And embarrassing failures in public transport on sea and rail. Some might even say that it is unarguable that every public service in the care of this SNP government ends 2019 in a worse state than when the year began. Surely in 2020, fixing this should be the priority of any government worthy of the name.
First Minister.
These are my priorities day in and day out, and I don't run from the record of my government. I put that record before the Scottish people in an election last week. And let me remind Jackson Carlaw what happened. The SNP won that election comprehensively and the Tories lost it just as comprehensively. All these tired lines were rejected by the electorate just last week, which is why in 2020 I'll get on with the job of improving our public services, of making sure that Scotland's public services continue to perform better than they do under the Tories in England and under Labour and Wales. By contrast, I'm going to predict, Presiding Officer, that the Tories will probably spend at least part of 2020 electing a new leader.
Question number 2, Richard Leonard.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and can I refer members to my register of interests? On the 22nd of May, speaking about the future of Scottish renewables and of the 3 bifab yards in Scotland, the First Minister told me and this Parliament that, and I quote, "I fully support the trade unions in their campaign to bring contracts and jobs to Scottish yards." So why do we learn today that more contracts and more jobs are going to the Far East?
First Minister.
I stand by what I said about Bifab and about other companies competing for this kind of work in Scotland. I would gently remind Richard Leonard, if it wasn't for the action this government took, there would be no Bifab in Scotland. It would already have closed. It's just a matter of weeks since Bifab did win a contract, and we will continue to work with companies and with trade unions to make sure that more of the work from the development of renewables in Scotland goes to the excellent Scottish supply chain. And I would actually hope that is an issue on which we would get the support of Scottish Labour, and I hope to continue to get that from Richard Leonard and his colleagues.
Richard Leonard.
Well, this is about jobs. Jobs for the NNG offshore contract are going to Indonesia. If this morning's reports are correct, jobs for the Sea Green offshore contract are going to China. Fabrication yards in Scotland are underutilised and skills are lying idle. Yet we know that less than 15% of the work on the NNG contract is going to the Scottish yards. This is not half a loaf, it's crumbs from the table. And even at that, these workers are being hired and fired on short-term casual contracts. In fact, workers at Arnish Point are being paid off tomorrow, just days before Christmas. Meanwhile, CS Wind in Machrihanish is also serving its workers with P45s. A decade ago, Alex Salmond promised that renewables would create so many jobs that we would become the Saudi Arabia of marine power. He predicted that there would be 130,000 jobs from offshore power generation. 10 years on, can the First Minister tell the workers at Arnish Point, at CS Wind and at those yards in Fife how many jobs there really are?
First Minister.
Can I say to Richard Leonard, I do genuinely appreciate his interest in these matters, but can I point out to Richard Leonard that many of the powers that influence this over energy, over employment law, for example, remain reserved to the United Kingdom government. So when Labour continues to have its period of reflection and considers again, in a very welcome way, its position on independence, perhaps these are all points that Richard Leonard and his colleagues would care to bear in mind. On the issue about the yards, I would say to those in Bifab that there would not be a Bifab right now but for the investment that this government has made to secure its future, and we will continue to do that. We'll host the second summit for the offshore wind sector in Edinburgh in January, and we will continue to maximise the potential of that sector. We've got a good record in supporting the offshore wind industry, and we'll continue to do that. But our hand in that would be considerably strengthened if we had Scottish Labour's support in getting all the powers into the hands of this Parliament. So I hope in 2020 that's a position that Scottish Labour will belatedly support.
Richard Leonard.
But you are in charge of the licensing of the seabed for offshore wind. You know, in 2012, the SNP reached an agreement with China. It spoke of Scotland as, and I quote, the destination of choice for key areas including renewable energy. In 2016, the SNP government secretly signed a memorandum of understanding with China. But it seems that under this government, the destination of choice for renewable energy jobs is not Scotland, it is China. First Minister, why are these companies like EDF and SSE ignoring you? Will you urgently speak to the Chief Executive of SSE today? Will you pick up the phone this afternoon? And will you finally understand that we don't simply need more summits, we need an industrial strategy. We need a plan for jobs, that this is just too important to be left to the market.
First Minister.
I know Richard Leonard's had a really difficult week, but that is really desperate stuff. And can I suggest to Richard Leonard that over the Christmas break, he maybe does a bit more homework on some of this. Maybe he looks at who controls the contract for difference process, that who continues to control the regulatory framework about these issues. And if he comes back from that and actually supports the devolution of these powers, then perhaps we can have a more constructive conversation. He asked me about talking to the Chief Executive of SSE. It's the work I did with SSE and other companies that made sure BIFAB didn't close a couple of years ago. We will continue to support BIFAB. We will continue to support all of these companies. And as on so many other issues, Richard Leonard cannot get away with simply willing the ends. He also has to will the means for this Scottish Government. And when he does that, perhaps, just perhaps, a few more people across Scotland might take him and his sorry party seriously.
Thank you. You have some constituency supplementaries. The first from Shona Robertson.
Can I ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government's response is to reports that Dover Fueling Solutions in my constituency have, with little or no notice, terminated the employment contracts of nearly 200 agency workers, understandably devastating many in the run-up to Christmas. Whilst it is a reserve matter, does the First Minister agree that it's time that the employment rights of temporary workers should be reviewed in the light of this kind of practice?
First Minister.
Yes, I do agree with that, and can I thank Shona Robertson for raising this important constituency issue. This news will obviously come as a blow to the affected agency staff at Dover Fueling Solutions in Dundee, especially at this time of year. I understand that some of the products and services are seasonal, then that is what the company says requires a reduction in temporary staff. PACE have already made contact with the agency and will offer support for any individuals if that should be required. And the Scottish Government, through Scottish Enterprise, continues to provide support to Dover Fueling Solutions to help grow the business with new export markets and products. The Scottish Government is fully committed to ensuring all workers across the country are treated and paid fairly by their employers. In the absence of powers over employment law, which should come to this Parliament but remain reserved to the UK Government, we will continue to do everything we can to promote fair work practices.
Liam Kerr, to be followed by Alison Johnson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First Minister, Amy Lorney was a beautiful, happy 5-year-old who tragically passed away from a brain tumour in September. Her mother, Angela Bain, started a petition to bring in Amy's rule, which she believes, like Ryan's rule in Australia, could prevent others having to go through a similar tragedy. At the beginning of November, Angela wrote to the Health Secretary seeking her thoughts on both the tragic death of poor Amy and her thoughts on Amy's rule. But disappointingly, 6 weeks later, Angela has received no response to that letter. So will the First Minister please ask the Health Secretary to respond to Angela's letter and perhaps give us some sense she's being listened to as she faces her first Christmas without brave Amy?
First Minister.
Well, can I firstly convey my sincere condolences to Amy's family. It is indeed a tragic case, and I'm sure the thoughts of all of us are with our families. They face their first Christmas without her. I will absolutely make sure that the letter, I'm sure the letter is being given full consideration, but I give an assurance that it will be given full consideration and a reply sent as soon as possible. But we will take very seriously and give proper consideration to the suggestions that are being made, and I'll ask the Health Secretary to correspond with Liam Kerr once we've had the opportunity to conclude that consideration.
Alison Johnston, to be followed by Jenny Mara.
Thank you. We're in the midst of a climate emergency, and the First Minister has ambitions to decarbonise aviation and for carbon capture and storage, but simple common sense measures are still overlooked as your government's looming failure to have even 10% of bike journeys by 2020 realised. But it's hard to cycle, of course, if you've got nowhere to store your bike. People who want to install a simple bike shed in a front garden must apply for planning permission at a cost of over £200. So will the First Minister act now to make bike storage simple and affordable?
First Minister.
Well, I'm always happy to consider suggestions of that nature. Of course, planning decisions are for local authorities. They are not for the Scottish Government to take nationally. But I do agree that it's important we do, and I don't mean this pejoratively, but it's important we do the small things as well as the big things to help us deal with the climate emergency. We are investing in active travel. A couple of years ago, we doubled the budget for active travel. So I certainly, in the spirit in which I'm sure the question was asked, I will take away that suggestion and come back to Alison Johnston as soon as possible.
And Jenny Mara.
Presiding Officer, we know that Scottish life expectancy is falling under this government. Last week, the National Records of Scotland said that the fastest falling life expectancy for men in the country is in the city of Dundee. This very sad and disgraceful fact cannot be separated from the Scottish drugs crisis and the tragic suicide rate. But I also believe that the lack of economic opportunities has a longer-term impact on our citizens' physical and mental health. Can I ask the First Minister what special measures she is putting in place to look at the Dundee economy and opportunities for our citizens? And I ask her again, what is she doing about the drugs crisis? Because I can tell her, as the weeks and months go by, it is not getting any better.
First Minister.
Well, firstly, can I say there have been, not just in Scotland, but across the UK and the wider world, welcome improvements in life expectancy over recent years. We start to see evidence of some stalling in that, not just in Scotland, but across the UK, Europe and the wider world as well. All of us have to address that. That's why we continue to be ambitious in our public health measures, not just around smoking and alcohol, but the task force around drugs deaths is really important, making sure we learn from lived experience there as well. So I hope that we can build consensus across the Chamber on some of the action that we want to take in future. In terms of Dundee, I would simply say to Jenny Mara, well, a few words to Jenny Mara, the Michelin investment, the investment from the government in the V&A, the waterfront development. There's no shortage of evidence in Dundee of the investment and the commitment and the confidence that this government has in that great city.
Question number 3, Willie Rennie.
Chloe Milne is from the East Neuk of Fife. She has a 3-year-old daughter. She was expecting nursery education with flexibility and choice, as promised by the First Minister. But she has been told she can only have 5 half-days, take it or leave it. Does that sound like choice and flexibility to the First Minister?
First Minister.
Not familiar with the details of the case. On the face of it, no, we would want to have greater flexibility. We are in the latter stages of the transformation of early years education and childcare, which is vastly increasing the hours that parents are entitled to and also increasing the flexibility. So I'm more than happy to look into the individual case, but on the generality, there is no doubt that because of the investment and the ambition of this government, many more children will benefit from many more hours of flexible, high-quality childcare in the years to come.
Willie Rennie.
Well, I hope she does, because this was a promise from the First Minister. Chloe said to me this week, I am really angry about these changes. These sessions are not suitable for anyone who works a full day. But there are other problems with the nursery rollout too. The 2-year-old take-up rate lies between poor and miserable. The graduate recruitment target has been missed and private nurseries are closing. But it's not just nursery. The Sick Kids Hospital in Edinburgh is still not open. The Queen Elizabeth Hospital has been beset by crisis. Our schools are falling behind in maths and science. The promised jobs in renewables have still not materialised. Homelessness services are broken beyond repair. I notice the SNP backbenches are shouting out their own examples of failure of this government. The cost of the 2 new ferries have doubled and they're 4 years late. The ScotRail contract has failed and mental health waiting times for children are their worst ever. The worst ever. This government should be embarrassed. Doesn't the First Minister see that every hour she takes off to hold another press conference at Butte House is another hour wasted in trying to sort out those issues for the people of Scotland?
Order. Before the First Minister replies, can I ask the Chamber, that's unacceptable, not to listen to a member ask a question. Mr Swinney. Mr Swinney. That was just barracking a member. Now, can I please ask members to listen to a member make their question, and we'll listen to the First Minister make a response.
Officer, I can't help feeling for the opposition parties this week. Their frustration is absolutely palpable. And not for the first time, Willie Rennie just appears to have borrowed Jackson Carlaw's question. As I said the other day, maybe they should just merge and be done with it. Let me look at the individual issues that were raised by Willie Rennie. So, early learning and childcare, he talked about graduate numbers and staffing. The number of staff working in funded ELC has increased, and we see more children getting access to more hours of early learning and childcare as we go from the doubling from 600 hours to 1,140 hours, which of course will take full effect next year. That is good news, which is probably why the Liberal Democrats don't really like it. On the health service, we're investing record sums in the health service. We're ensuring record numbers of staff working in our health service, and we will continue to deliver the improvements in waiting times under the Waiting Times Improvement Programme. On education and the PISA results, of course, we've seen the vast improvement in reading performance, and we're now going to ensure that on maths and science as well. We see increasing numbers of teachers in our schools, and of course we continue to invest in making sure that we're raising attainment and closing the attainment gap. So we will continue on all of these things to get on with the job of building a better, fairer, more prosperous Scotland, and that is what the opposition don't really like.
Some further supplementaries. The first from David Stewart.
Presiding Officer, the First Minister will be well aware from reports in yesterday's Times that only a quarter of Scotland's schools have sprinklers installed to slow down fires. According to Scottish Fire and Rescue Service, 66 primary and secondary schools face a high risk of fire. New schools, of course, require sprinklers, but will the First Minister arrange an urgent New Year's meeting with local authorities to identify high-risk older schools to retrofit sprinklers to protect our pupils, our teachers and our staff?
First Minister.
Well, can I thank David Stewart for raising an important issue. I'll ask the Deputy First Minister to respond in detail, including on the suggestion of a meeting in the new year. But of course, it is the responsibility of local authorities who are responsible for the school estate, working with the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service to make sure that there are fire safety plans in place for our schools, as indeed for other public buildings. This government is investing and has invested heavily in the fabric of the school estate. We see the number of new and refurbished buildings across the country and the percentage of young people learning in good, fit-for-purpose, state-of-the-art buildings increasing, and that is an investment that we are determined to continue.
Thank you. Kenneth Gibson to be followed by Andy Whiteman.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The festive season is a difficult time of year for people who are homeless, struggling on low incomes, and who may even have to seek the assistance of food banks. First Minister, to what extent have such problems been exacerbated by the heartless UK Tory government, which has impoverished so many, not least through its ideologically driven welfare reform policies?
First Minister.
Well, I think everybody, with the possible exception of the Scottish Conservatives, accepts the link between welfare cuts and the rise in poverty and in homelessness. And we know from expert opinion during the general election campaign that the Tories' manifesto is likely to lead to a rise in child poverty, taking it to historically high levels. So that is unacceptable. It is something that I think deeply shames the Conservative Party, and I hope that the new government, I don't have high expectations, but I hope the new government takes action to address that as a matter of urgency. This government will continue to take our responsibilities seriously on homelessness. We are investing heavily in helping those who are homeless or rough sleeping, but also changing the way we provide those services. So Housing First is a key plank of what we are doing to try to make sure that people have access to housing, but also the support they need to sustain tenancies. And we'll continue to, of course, mitigate as far as we can Tory welfare cuts and use our own welfare powers to lift those in poverty out of poverty. So we will do everything we can, but I hope we see a very urgent change of attitude and response from the United Kingdom Government.
Andy Whiteman to be followed by Daniel Johnston.
A month ago, the First Minister told my colleague Alison Johnston, and I quote, "We will continue to take the right steps to protect wildlife and will do that without fear or favour with regard to any vested interest." Presiding Officer, we've waited over 2 years for the Werrity review. Is the First Minister surprised that having appointed 2 representatives of the grouse shooting lobby to a review of grouse shooting, that they have used their effective veto to sabotage what would otherwise be a clear recommendation to licence grouse shooting now?
First Minister.
Well, the Werrity review has been published now, and all members can look to see the recommendation. The central recommendation around the timescale for moving to greater regulation was not a unanimous recommendation. Andy Whiteman is right to point to that. That is one of the reasons the government will take time now to consider that recommendation, and I want to be very clear that part of that consideration will be looking at whether we move to regulation on a much quicker time frame, and we will take the views of stakeholders before coming to a final view on that. The option of a licensing scheme absolutely needs to be considered, and if that is the view of stakeholders, and if we consider that necessary, and as I say, it is a serious consideration, we will certainly move to implement that earlier than the 5-year timeframe suggested by the review group.
Daniel Johnston.
Scotland published a Section 22 report into the issues surrounding the delayed opening of the new Sick Kids Hospital in Edinburgh. It drew explicit and clear comparison with the issues with Edinburgh's schools that led to the collapsed wall at Oxgangs Primary School that serves my constituency. The call report on the Edinburgh schools centred on the issues surrounding the design and build methodology, a methodology that outsources the quality control and detailed design of these critical public buildings. Audit Scotland say the lessons from these issues identified by Cole had not been learned by Lothian Health Board. So given that there are currently a total of 5 capital projects across Scotland currently under construction in the health estate, does the First Minister agree with me that we cannot wait for an inquiry into to learn these lessons, that each of these projects must urgently be reviewed into whether or not they will be safe to open? And does she agree with me that there are fundamental questions about the suitability of design and build when it comes to the building of critical buildings such as schools and hospitals? Because as one professional put it to me, design and build is fine if you're building supermarkets. It's not good enough if you're building hospitals and schools.
First Minister.
Well, I do generally agree with the member's comments, and let me make 2 points, one which is more immediate term and one which is, of course, slightly longer term in terms of looking at some fundamental questions. We have given a commitment, I'm sure Daniel Johnston is aware of it, to establish a new national centre on infrastructure expertise, and that has absolute relevance to ongoing projects, because I do think we need to make sure we're learning lessons as we go and not simply waiting for a public inquiry. That said, the public inquiry is very important. It is an opportunity to look at some of these fundamental questions, and indeed the Audit Scotland Section 22 report that Daniel Johnston referred to, published yesterday, itself sets out areas that the public inquiry might want to consider, including clarity of guidance, contractual implications, and the role and the effectiveness of oversight and scrutiny. So yes, we need to make sure that lessons that need to be learned now are being learned, and that these are relevant to ongoing projects, but that we make sure some of these longer term questions are properly considered. And I think the approach the government is taking is designed to do both of these things.
And Claudia Beamish.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Further to Andy Whiteman's question on the Werity report, long awaited, and recognising the complexity of the issue and the need for sustainable development for rural Scotland, let's all recall that a fifth of Scotland is driven grouse moors, and Scottish Labour is very disappointed that the report recommends a 5-year delay before consideration of licensing in the climate emergency and biodiversity emergency. Does the First Minister agree that the time to consult on the following is now: licensing, the possibility of a ban of burning of deep peat with appropriate exemptions as one of a range of options, outlawing of types of snares and the mass mountain hare cull, and a range of other issues? Now, not 5 years. Thank you.
First Minister.
Well, I think I did answer that specific question in response to Andy Whiteman, but I'm happy to do so again. Firstly, the Werity review was independent of government. It has made a set of recommendations. Not all of that was unanimous, and that is something that has already been pointed out. We will give careful consideration to all of the recommendations alongside other evidence before we issue a full response, and we will, as part of that, meet key stakeholders to discuss the findings. But on the issue of licensing, I think I said very clearly to Andy Whiteman that part of our consideration will be the possibility of moving to a licensing scheme much earlier than the 5-year time frame that was suggested by the review group. So everybody who has an interest in this, we would welcome their input, and of course we will issue a response to the Werity recommendations as soon as we are able to do that.
Thank you. Question for Bruce Crawford.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister when the Scottish Government expects to publish its budget.
First Minister.
Well, we're focused on introducing a Scottish budget for 2020-21 at the earliest practical opportunity, and we're working closely with the Finance and Constitution Committee and the Scottish Fiscal Commission to determine the best approach in the circumstances we face. Without the UK budget, though, we do not have clarity on the funding available for public services in Scotland, and this unnecessary delay has wide knock-on effects, including for Scotland's local councils, health boards and third sector. We will continue to engage with the Parliament, local government, trade unions and others on this process, but we do need the UK Government to announce its budget date and publish its budget as soon as possible, and I very much hope that is what happens.
Bruce Crawford.
I thank the First Minister for answer. Since the election of the Johnston Government, has the Scottish Government been given any hard information on the date of the UK budget for the financial year 2021? I'm aware of speculation that the UK budget could be set as late as February or even March. If this speculation proves to be accurate, does the First Minister agree with me that a UK budget at such a late stage shows either a fundamental misunderstanding of the serious problems this creates for devolved Parliament, or a total disrespect and disregard for the consequences of the impact on vital public services, and in particular the setting of local council budgets?
First Minister.
In truth, I think it's a combination of all of these things: misunderstanding, disrespect and disregard. But the most important thing from the government's perspective is it makes it impossible for us to put forward and pass a budget through this Parliament. People assume that the budget was delayed because of the election. Of course, if we remember back, the government had cancelled the budget before the election was called. So, there you've got that misunderstanding, disregard, disrespect, call it what you want. Since the new government was elected last week, we've not yet had confirmation of the budget date. There has been, as Bruce Crawford said, speculation that it won't be until March, which would be completely unacceptable. The Finance Secretary wrote to the Treasury in this matter in early November, but still hasn't had a reply. I certainly welcome Bruce Crawford's recent letter to the Treasury in his capacity as convener of the Finance and Constitution Committee. The Treasury really should be in no doubt about the seriousness of this matter, and I look forward to dialogue and meaningful progress. And I hope party differences and party politics aside, this whole Parliament will unite in making clear to the Treasury how important it is that we have a date set as soon as possible, and that that date is as early as possible, in order that this Parliament can get on with its vital task of setting a budget.
Roger Fraser.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm sure the First Minister would acknowledge that there would be no point proceeding with the UK budget in advance of the general election, and the general election that she and her party called for meant that the budget could not be brought forward at that time. But would she also accept that the Conservative victory in the general election means that the Conservative manifesto pledge of billions extra in Barnett consequentials for the Scottish Government will now be delivered upon, in contrast to the SNP manifesto, which the respected Institute for Fiscal Studies said would deliver greater austerity for Scotland than under the Conservatives?
First Minister.
Well, of course, I would remind Murdo Fraser, as I said in response to Bruce Crawford, this myth that it was the election that led to the delay in the budget, that the government had pulled the budget before the election was called. They did it, I seem to recall, in a fit of pique after they lost one of the many votes they lost in the House of Commons. So the UK government was always playing politics with the budget, and that's got to stop. I hope it stops very quickly, and I hope even Murdo Fraser, with his blind loyalty to Boris Johnson and his Tory colleagues, would see how unacceptable it is for this Parliament to be in the position of not being able to present and pass a budget. And as far as the consequentials are concerned, I hope Parliament will understand that I will wait to see the colour of the money before spending it, because we've had promises before from the Tories about extra money for the health service that didn't quite fully materialise. And the last point I would make, Presiding Officer, is this. Our budget next year will be £1.5 billion in real terms lower than it was at the start of the decade. That's the impact of Tory austerity. So it's going to have to go some considerable way to make up that loss that Scotland has suffered because of Conservative government at Westminster, that hopefully is soon coming to an end.
Question 5, Michelle Ballantyne.
To ask the First Minister what action the Scottish Government is taking to help pupils with additional support needs.
First Minister.
There's been a significant increase in the number of pupils with additional support needs. The latest statistics show that in 2019 there were 215,897 pupils reported as having additional support needs, which represents 30.9% of all school pupils. That's an increase of 2.2% compared with last year. To support education authorities in their duties under the Additional Support for Learning Act, over this financial year, the Scottish Government will invest an extra £15 million to recruit around 1,000 extra pupil support assistants to work with children with additional support needs. We've also commissioned an independently chaired review on the implementation of additional support for learning, and the findings of that review are expected in early 2020.
Ballantyne.
Thank you. The First Minister is quite correct. We've had an 82% rise since 2012 in school children that have been identified with additional support needs. And whilst it is encouraging that we are now identifying these issues, organisations like the Scottish Children's Services Coalition and the EAS have highlighted that children requiring support are experiencing frustration and stress as demand for ASN specialists grows. The Scottish Government's own figures suggest that the problem may be getting worse. We have fewer teachers than in 2007, and the number of special needs teachers has fallen year on year since 2013, and spending on ASM pupils has fallen by almost £1,000 per pupil. In the last year, nearly 15,000 children across Scotland have been handed exclusions. And while this is a welcome decrease, the figures highlight that students with additional support needs are 5 times more likely to be excluded than those without. So although this may be the right decision in some cases, does the First Minister recognise that the current framework can disadvantage pupils with ASN?
First Minister.
Well, these are important issues. I think, firstly, it is important that the additional needs of children are being identified, and I think we should all welcome that. That, therefore, means that we must invest to ensure that those needs can be properly addressed. That's why what I said in my original answer about the extra investment to recruit around 1,000 extra pupil support assistants to work with children with additional needs is so important. We also, of course, see teacher numbers rising. The statistics published just a week or so ago showed teacher numbers had increased for the 4th year in a row. There are now more teachers in our schools than at any time since 2009. And looking again at ASL teachers, they have increased in the most recent years, and all staff supporting pupils with ASN have also increased. So we are investing, supporting local authorities to meet their duties under the legislation. And it's one of the many reasons why this government has and always will opt for investment in public services over the Conservative priority of tax cuts for the wealthiest in our society.
Question number 6, Polly McNeill.
To ask the First Minister what action the Scottish Government is taking to prevent people with mental health conditions becoming homeless.
First Minister.
Our mental health strategy aims to ensure that people get the right help at the right time, free from stigma, through a range of actions being rolled out across the country. We continue to work with partners to develop specific support aimed at tackling the risk of homelessness amongst those experiencing mental health difficulties. Scotland, of course, has some of the strongest rights in the world for homeless people, ensuring that those threatened with homelessness are entitled to help from their local authority to secure a stable home. And, of course, we want to go further and end homelessness altogether. We've invested £32.5 million out of our £50 million Ending Homelessness Fund into the delivery of rapid rehousing and Housing First, together with local authorities to support people into settled accommodation.
Polly McNeill.
The First Minister will be aware that the number of people in Scotland who are citing mental health as a factor in becoming homeless is rising. In fact, in last year, over twice as many people said that they struggle to maintain their accommodation because of a mental health condition. That's compared to 10 years ago. Crisis have suggested that hospitals which see more than 200 homeless patients a year should have a full pathway team, so that would be a GP, nursing staff and a dedicated housing worker. So to stop, obviously, the decline of that individual, to keep them in their homes first and foremost. Am I right in saying, First Minister, that the Scottish Government has committed to a legal duty to prevent homelessness amongst agencies? If that is the case, I wonder if you could tell Parliament if any progress has been made on that. Are they committed to doing that? And further, to keeping people in their homes, would you also consider a commitment to ensuring no winter evictions in the cold months, so we can ensure that we can keep people in their homes before they lose their tenancies in the first place?
First Minister.
Well, in terms of things we're committed to, we are committed to taking forward all of the recommendations that came out of the Homelessness and Rough Sleeping Task Force, and I'll ask the Housing Minister to write to Polly McNeill specifically with an update on all of that. In terms of the general response to Polly McNeill, firstly on ending winter evictions, I want us to work to a situation where we're reducing the potential for eviction, not just in the winter, but at all times of year, and we are supporting people to sustain tenancies. That is why the Housing First approach is so important, where Scotland, I think, is leading the UK right now in the investment and the commitment we're showing to that approach. It's about making sure that people who have been homeless or who are at risk of homelessness don't just get stable accommodation, but they also get the range of support services that allow them to sustain that tenancy. So these are all important issues. Polly McNeill mentioned Crisis. Of course, we have worked closely with Crisis and will continue to do so in taking forward all of these different strands of work. And I'd be happy to get an update to Polly McNeill on where progress is at on each and every one of those.
Question 7, Edward Mountain.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what alternative holiday arrangements have been made for staff from the emergency services who will be working over the Christmas period.
First Minister.
I am enormously grateful, as I'm sure we all are, for the hard work of all of our emergency service workers at all times of year, but particularly over the festive period, and I thank them and their families for the sacrifices they make to support us to feel safe and well. Emergency workers receive either time off in lieu or an additional payment for working on public holidays.
Edward Mountain.
And I thank the First Minister for those comments. I agree with her that I believe we should all take time to remember and thank those who work over the Christmas and New Year. They do so we can celebrate this festive time with our families. They are working not only to keep us safe, but also to provide help should we need it. Will the First Minister join with me in thanking again all those who work on our behalf over the festive period? And will she encourage everyone to pause briefly over the Christmas period and remember those from the emergency and armed services who will always be on duty as they have given us their all?
First Minister.
Yes, I'm very happy to endorse those comments and that sentiment completely. I would take this opportunity to thank all of those working in our emergency services for what they do all year round, but particularly for the sacrifices that they make at this time of year to keep the rest of us feeling safe, secure and well looked after. So to our nurses, doctors, everybody working in our National Health Service, to our police officers, to our firefighters, to those in the armed forces, my grateful and heartfelt thanks. And I would encourage everybody, over this festive period to take that moment to pause and remember the great sacrifices they make on behalf of the rest of us. So let me end, if we are ending, I don't know, Presiding Officer, by wishing all of them a very happy Christmas indeed, by wishing you and all members across the Chamber and all members across the country a very happy Christmas.
Thank you very much. That concludes First Minister's questions. There's no members' business, so I'm going to suspend until 1... Oh, sorry. Sorry. Point of order, Maurice Corrie.
Presiding Officer, I realise the excitement of Christmas is nearly upon us, but it was utterly impossible to hear the latter part of Willie Rennie's question and points. Perhaps, Presiding Officer, you might like to invite him
Let's hear
to
Mr. Corrie,
repeat
please.
his question and points again to this chamber now.
Thank you, Mr. Corrie. I think the point is very well made. I will excuse members today. I think that they're tired after the election and looking forward to Christmas. We'll resume at 1:45.
Well, no one in Scotland can commission an idea. You know, if I went to BBC Scotland and I said, oh, I've got this great idea for a sitcom, I've got this brilliant idea for a drama, you know, no, there isn't one person in Scotland that can okay it unless it goes through London.
Good morning and welcome to another edition of Full Scottish and what's happening today.
Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland.
Scotland's going to be an independent country.
That need, that desire for independence is ever stronger than perhaps it was in 2014. So there's an obligation that we've got to give leadership to that campaign. That's what Nicola Sturgeon, as our First Minister, has been doing.
My feeling about Boris Johnson is he can't be trusted on anything.
It is now and forever will be known as the rape clause.
I'm old enough to remember going into Europe in '73, and I remember how much of a razor's edge that was Ballastone. And I think we made it by 53%, if I remember correctly, for going in. And ever since that time, England particularly has been pretty much schizophrenic, down the middle about whether it felt British or whether it felt European. And that schism, that crack has remained throughout English society ever since.
Scotland means business. Scotland's voice won't be stilled, it won't be silenced, it has to be heard.
The work that's been done by Broadcasting Scotland in giving community activists, yes activists, Scottish activists a platform other than the traditional media outlets.